Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through my entire process for this little set of 3 fall-inspired ink and watercolor illustrations. I'm going to be sharing absolutely everything, starting with my preliminary freehand pencil sketches. Then I'll be moving on to sharing my pen and ink, alternative shading, and mark making techniques that I use for this style of illustration. And then we'll be moving on to adding in some color using watercolor. So it's going to be a great opportunity to practice our sketching and our watercolor painting, and it's going to be great for beginners. Not only will these be awesome practice, but these illustrations would look awesome in bookmarks or greeting cards that you might want to give away during this season. One more thing that I want to mention before jumping in is I'm going to be working on this hot press ready-cut watercolor paper from Strathmore. I'm often asked what kind of watercolor paper I use for pen and watercolor wash pieces. I like using watercolor paper that is at least 140 pounds in thickness or in weight. And I also enjoy using watercolor paper that is not so rough, not so heavily textured. Especially when I'm going to be bringing in my pen, I don't want to feel like I have to fight against the tooth of my paper or like I'm gonna damage my pen. But there are artists who create amazing pen and watercolor wash pieces on more textured paper, and it's really just a matter of preference. If you don't mind the texture and having your lines skip over that tooth a little bit, then you might be just fine with cold press watercolor paper. Of course, even within the cold press paper, different brands have different amounts of texture to them. So it is going to come down to you exploring, experimenting, and finding out what you like and what leads to the results that you enjoy. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with the very first part of this process, which is creating our pencil sketches. I like using an HB drawing pencil for this freehand sketching process. It helps me draw lightly. Of course, I make sure that I'm not pressing down very much on my paper at all, because I don't want to scratch or damage my paper in any way. And also, I want to be able to easily correct my mistakes. And the other reason is because at the end, I don't want to be able to see my pencil work through my ink work and also my watercolor. So for all of these reasons, I make sure to sketch very, very lightly. The way that I almost always start my freehand pencil sketches, doesn't matter what it is that I am drawing, is by laying down what I like to refer to as envelopes. So I focus on the outer contour of whatever it is that I am sketching. It's helpful for me to think about it as my subject or object being wrapped in wrapping paper and just acknowledging the general overall shape as a whole and really tuning out everything that is smaller. I lay down general blocky shapes focusing on major angles, and I don't really worry about creating perfect curves or anything like that. I mostly lay down just a very geometric-y shape with straighter lines, focusing primarily on proportions, so the width versus height of the object, the relationship between the different parts making up the whole in terms of how their widths compare, how their heights compare, how they align with each other, the angles they create when they're placed upon each other, that kind of thing. And I just start laying down lines. And I noticed angles, of course, and I try that the angles that I lay down those lines in will then help me create the curves that I'll be refining. And I make my way from largest general shapes towards smaller shapes. So once I have that envelope in a proportion that looks good to me, I then break it up into medium-sized shapes, and I really don't add in any smaller details until after the larger shapes have been effectively created. And in this case, because I'm going to be adding detail with pen and ink, and then I'm going to be adding color with watercolor, I'm really leaving the detail to a minimum. In the past, I've shared more freehand sketching tip videos and more of my process in depth when it comes to sketching. I'm gonna make sure to leave links to that down below in the description box in case you'd like to check out some videos of mine in which I focus primarily on sketching. I went through the exact same process for the mushroom. I basically laid down the largest shapes first, focusing on proportions, on locations of elements, and making my way from largest towards smaller shapes and details. You've probably seen me use my kneaded eraser to do some gentle tapping over my sketch to lighten it up a little bit more, at least a couple of times by this point. I find it super helpful to have a kneaded eraser on hand aside from my regular soft graphite eraser. It helps me keep things relatively clean and light. And finally, when it came to the sunflower, what I like doing with sunflowers and other types of flowers as well that kind of have this similar structure is I create that outer envelope or largest envelope shape that is going to basically tell me the entire size of this petal area of the sunflower. And then I add in that smaller shape inside of the larger envelope, which is going to tell me the location and the size of the central part of the flower. And this is an important thing to get in for flowers because different flowers have different petal structures and also a different relationship in terms of that proportion between the middle section of the petals and the petals themselves. Sunflowers have a very large central area in the middle of those petals when compared to smaller wildflowers and other types of flowers. And so it's very important to get these characteristics in since the beginning if we really want our flower to look like a particular type of flower. So notice that relationship, notice those proportions of the flower, and then lay down your envelopes so that you can start visualizing the size of these different parts so that the relationship between these different parts of the flower will make sense in terms of the particular flower that you're drawing. Once I have those major envelopes in, you can now see me start drawing the individual petals. And you can see how I am using the size of that larger envelope shape that I had previously laid down for myself to visualize the length of those petals. In terms of the petals themselves, it's also very important to acknowledge the shape of the petals of the particular flower that you're drawing. Different types of flowers have different types of petals. Sunflower petals are kind of tapered at their ends and are a little bit long. I wouldn't say super long, but they are longer than other, like for example, daisies and stuff like that. And so once I have visualized that shape for the petals, I start adding them in all around that central area, making sure that these shapes look like they are all attached to that central area that I already created for myself. Now, when it comes to adding in the petals, even though, yes, you're taking into account that outer envelope in order to visualize the length, and even though you have a particular shape in mind for those petals, it's important that because this is a natural organic object, there is a lot of irregularity within or among those petals that you are drawing. You want them to cluster together in different ways, to overlap on top of each other in different ways. Maybe some of them are slightly wider or slightly longer. You definitely want to stay away from anything that looks too stiff or too organized or too patterny, because that's not going to look very natural. I don't like adding the petals in clockwise or counterclockwise, but actually jump around and start adding them in like that, because it helps me create more of a natural looking overlapping, and it helps me stay away from patterns. Once I was done with adding in the petals, I then erased my initial largest envelope. I'm now going in to do some cleanup and some lightening up using my kneaded eraser and gentle tapping. And finally, I went back in with my pencil and retraced over some of my lines that I maybe had erased a little bit too much. Okay, and with that, I'm all done. I'm gonna go ahead and get started with my pen and ink process. I'm gonna be using one of my pigment liners from Stadler in 0.3 size. These pens work very well when you combine them with watercolor because their ink is permanent and smudge proof. So as long as you allow that ink to settle into the paper and dry completely before bringing in your watercolor, it is not going to budge, it's not going to smudge, it's not going to move around. So I've shared past videos on pen and ink, alternative shading, and mark making techniques, and major tips to have in mind for beginners getting started with this medium in the past, which I'm going to make sure to link to down below in the description box in case you're interested in learning more about pen and ink and improving your skills with this medium. Because I'm going to be bringing in watercolor in a bit, I'm not going to go super into depth into pen and ink specifically, but I will say that if you take time to practice different alternative shading and mark making techniques on their own, in isolation, and doing drills such as drawing different kinds of lines and shapes with your pen. And I'd also highly recommend really taking time to explore the difference between the different types of lines and marks that you can create by varying and altering 4 different things when it comes to drawing with pen. So notice the difference between the lines and marks that you lay down when you are drawing your lines and marks slowly versus what they look like when you're drawing your lines and marks quickly. Also notice the difference that happens in your lines and marks when you alter or vary the angle at which you're using your pen. Notice the difference between the lines and marks that you are creating when you use your pen at more of a 90-degree angle from your paper versus a 45-degree angle versus less than a 45-degree angle. Notice the difference also that happens in your lines and marks when you are exerting less or more pressure on your pen. And finally, also explore different pen tip sizes if you're able to. Notice the difference in thicknesses and also in heaviness that different pen tip sizes allow. That is going to provide you greater control over your drawing tool, so that you're able to develop a nice line weight variation throughout your drawing. And also you're going to have different tools so that you can better create a strategy for yourself in terms of which specific alternative shading or mark making techniques you're going to be going in with to develop your different values, your lights, midtones, and darks, and your textures in the object or subject on hand. All right, so having said all that, the very first thing that I like doing, the first step that I go in with when I am doing my ink work for this kind of illustration is I like going in and defining the edges of my object or my subject. I don't go in and create heavy outlines around my subject and all of the different elements making up my subject. Essentially, I trace over my pencil work in sections, and I make sure to work relatively quickly and loosely so that I can make sure that there is a line weight variation throughout the lines that I am creating. I don't want to create any heaviness or any thick lines that will look too heavy and will just make everything look too flat. You can even notice how my lines are not even connecting here and there. And this is all because I want to stay away from the look of thick outlines, cartoony outlines, or like coloring book page kind of outlines. I'm really trying to create thinner lines and having certain sections of my lines look thinner and lighter and other sections of my lines look thicker and darker. That's what line weight variation is all about. And oftentimes working more quickly and laying down those lines and marks more confidently is going to help you arrive at a better line weight variation. And of course, this comes with practice. And I cannot recommend doing those kinds of drills enough, because they will help you increase your confidence and lay down your lines and marks much more quickly when you're actually creating a full drawing or illustration. All right, so after having defined my edges, I went in with contour and cross contour lines for this pumpkin. As I explained in a past alternative shading and mark making technique video in which you saw me shading spheres, I'll make sure to link to that below. Contour and cross contour lines are pretty awesome to use when you're going to be developing values in a complex object or structure that has a lot of curves to it, because this technique helps you enhance that roundness and those curves. To do contour lines, you have to have in mind the three-dimensional structure of whatever it is that you are shading in. Imagine if you were drawing lines with Sharpie all around the object that you are shading in. Those are basically contour lines. Another way to think about it is think of rubber bands wrapping around that object. These black Sharpie lines or rubber bands could be going vertically or they could be going horizontally. Just think of the curve created by those Sharpie lines or those rubber bands if they were wrapping around or drawn around that object. So when you're laying down your groups of curves, make sure that you're thinking of the curvature in that section of that object. What would the lines created by the Sharpie or the rubber bands look like in that section of that object? And then draw your lines with that in mind. Now, as you can see, I am not drawing these curves all throughout my subject. I am just adding them into darker midtone areas and darkest dark areas, meaning I am bringing to mind the three-dimensional structure of pumpkins and where it would make sense that darkest areas would be, and that's where I'm laying down those curves. Now, if I want to darken areas even further to really push darkest dark areas, that's where I'm going in with the cross contour lines and laying down another group of curves on top of the first that is intersecting that first group of curves that I laid down. This covers up a greater amount of paper, which transmits a darker value. Always remember that with contour and cross contour lines and any other alternative shading technique such as scribbling, stippling, hatching, cross hatching, etc., the less amount of marks that you create, the greater amount of paper you leave free of lines and marks, the lighter the value. And the more amount of lines and marks you add in, the more paper you cover up, so you create a darker value. And if you want to transmit any sense of 3D-ness, even if you're not going for super high levels of realism, you need lighter value areas in which the paper is shining through, you need mid-tone areas in which the paper is partially covered, and you need darker areas in which the paper is covered up even more. I don't want to go overboard though with my description of different values because I am going to be bringing in watercolor. I'm really just looking to give this object a bit of roundness. Once I was happy with the values that I had developed throughout the pumpkin, I added in some quick and loose textural marks to help me describe a little bit of the imperfection and irregularity present in this organic, natural item. It was then time to move on to the mushroom, and you're gonna notice how my process is exactly the same that I used in the pumpkin. So initially I go in to define my edges. I then go in with my alternative shading or mark making technique that I use to subtly describe my different values throughout this mushroom, meaning I'm trying to describe at least a few lights, midtones, and darks using contour lines. I decided to go with contour lines for this item as well because of all of the curves present, the roundness present in this item. I did my best not to go overboard with the amounts of lines and marks because I knew that I would be describing some values with my watercolor as well. And once I was happy with my different values, I added in some textural marks. It was then time to move on to the sunflower. And with the sunflower, I did bring in quite a bit of scribbling, especially to create that texture in the central part of the flower. But you can see how I started by using my scribbling to kind of start defining the outer edges of that central section, which is very textured. It's very helpful to give thought to the irregularity present in the edges of very textured sections. Instead of just drawing them smoothly, think of how that texture would create irregularity throughout that edge. And then think of the kind of mark making technique that will help you describe that irregular edge. Once I describe those edges in the central part and a bit in the centralmost part as well, which is going to be even darker than the larger central section, I then started defining the edges of the petals themselves. And I really tried to approach the definition of the edges of the petals the same way that I have with my different items. I tried to draw these lines quickly, relatively loosely, and in sections. And this is in order to stay away from the look of thick, heavy outlines, which will lead to things looking much more stiffer and flatter. Once I'm done with this definition of edges, what I'm gonna do is add in a few very light tapered lines that are gonna help me subtly describe the inner veins and irregularity present within these petals. And what I do for this is I create those tapered lines by flicking my wrist inwards and upwards. So I start some of these lines in the outermost tip of the petal going in, so flicking my wrist in. And then I create others by flicking my wrist upwards, starting in the innermost part of that petal, closest to the central part. I'm trying to leave a section of paper with little to no lines in it, especially in that middle portion of the petal. But I do my best to keep everything very irregular and very light. And finally, I'm going to be both developing a darker value as well as adding texture with scribbling in the innermost section of the sunflower. So when it comes to the centralmost innermost part of that sunflower, I do go in with plenty more scribbling because I actually want to darken that value in that area while creating that texture. And then in the outer section, I go in with a less amount of scribbling. I do want to develop somewhat of a variety of values even in that outer round portion, but I don't want to get it as dark as that centralmost section. I just want to create a subtle hint of darker mid-tone, especially around the edges, and I also want to develop a little bit of texture in this area as well. Right around here, I decided to take a quick second before jumping into the painting process to add a little bit more detail into that bottom part of the mushroom and also more contour lines along the right and left edges of that stem in order to round it out a little bit more. For these quick illustrations, I'm going to be using colors from my Van Gogh Botanical Watercolor Half Pan paint set. I'm going to be using only 5 different colors for all 3 illustrations, and these colors are Indian Yellow, Permanent Red Light, Raw Sienna, Burnt Sienna, and Van Dyke Brown. You do not have to use the same colors that I'm going to be using. I'm going to be swatching all of these out for you so that you can see what they look like on paper and you can replace them with anything you have on hand that's similar. All right, so once I was ready to get started with the watercolor painting, what I did was I started creating my color mixtures that I would be using for the pumpkin. Even though this is a quicker, looser illustration style, I do want to make sure that I set myself up for success to add a little bit more dimension into my illustrations by creating a variety of different color mixtures on my color mixing palette that will help me develop my different values and also a difference in hues within that pumpkin and just be able to paint it in nice and quick with my color mixers prepared for me. So what I am doing here on my color mixing palette is I am creating a lighter orange, a darker orange, and an even darker color that I'm going to use in the pumpkin to push darker value areas. I'm also going to be preparing a lighter brown and a darker brown for the stem. The first color mixture that I created on the top right well on my color mixing palette is my lighter orange. To create this color, I mixed together my Indian yellow and my permanent red light. To create the second darker reddish orange color in the middle there, I mixed together the same two colors, just that this time the ratio was different. This time, this color mixture had way more of the red in it than of the yellow. And then to the left of that, on that top left corner on my color mixing palette, that is just pure burnt sienna with some water in it. What I'm getting started with right here is creating my lighter brown that I'm going to be using for the stem. And this lighter brown is a mixture of raw sienna with a little bit of Van Dyke brown to darken it just a little. And then to the left of that, I have some pure Van Dyke brown with some water in it. I'm making sure that all of the mixtures that I create are nice and juicy and saturated on my color mixing palette. I want a good amount of pigment in them, but also some water. I would say I'm looking for somewhere around 50% paint and 50% water in my color mixtures. I'm going to swatch out all of these colors right here on my scrap piece of watercolor paper for you. I would highly recommend having scrap pieces of watercolor paper on hand when you're painting with this medium so that you can test out colors and translucencies before going in. Because remember, when painting with this medium, once you have paint on paper, there is no going back to the whiteness that the paper once had. All right, so the only two paintbrushes that I use for these illustrations were a size 5 round brush and a size 2 round brush. That is it. And I'm just making sure to completely rinse out my paintbrush bristles between my colors. Okay, so the process that I'm gonna be using to paint in all of these items is exactly the same. I get started with my larger brush of the two. This is my size 5. I load it up well with the lightest color that I've prepared for the item on hand, which in this case is a lighter orange. And I go right in and paint quick because we're painting on dry paper and we don't want to be left with hard defined edges around the shapes that we start painting in. The moment that we start placing paint on paper, it starts to dry. So if you don't paint quickly, you're probably going to be left with edges around your shapes. So wherever I left off, if I'm going to reload my paintbrush, I pick up right from that edge where I left off quickly and continue moving on. You can see how I left little sections of paper shining through with that initial layer of lighter color. And this is something that happens organically as I'm moving my paintbrush around quickly, but I embrace many of these shapes that happen organically as highlights. Remember that when painting with this medium, the whiteness of the paper stands in place for our highlights. And if I don't keep any highlights protected, then I'm gonna automatically get rid of the opportunity to create the lightest values. And the highlights or lightest values are important if we want to create a sense of 3D-ness to what we're painting. So I just embrace them as highlights. With that initial layer of lightest orange in and still wet, I drop in the medium color in darker mid-tone sections that I want to push darker values in. And because that initial layer of lighter orange is still wet, that second darker color merges and bleeds and expands and creates gradients into that previous color. I am focusing on dropping in the second darker color in areas that I want to darken. So once again, I bring to mind the three-dimensional structure of pumpkins and where I would have mid-tone values, darker values. That's where I place the second darker color. Because we're working quickly, everything should still be pretty wet, but if certain sections start drying for you and you want to go in to soften edges, or you want to go in and manually bring the two colors together a little bit more to create gradients, you can go in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush, but try to keep that work to a minimum. Essentially, the less you go in to move your paint around after it's been placed on paper, the better. finally, with everything still wet, I drop in a tiny bit of that darkest color that I am using in the orange section of the pumpkin, which is the burnt sienna. And this darker color, I really just add into the darkest sections that I want to push darker values in. So essentially, the darker I get with my color, the less color I place on paper. I'm just looking to darken sections that need to be darkened. It was then time to move on to painting the stem. And for this smaller section, I switched on over to my size 2 round brush. And I went in initially with my lighter brown, which is the mixture of the raw sienna with a bit of Van Dyke brown. And with that initial layer of lighter brown still wet, I go in and drop in some of my darker brown, so my pure Van Dyke brown with some water in it, in little sections that I wanted to push darker values in. Notice how even in this small part of the pumpkin, I still left little teeny tiny sections of white paper shining through so that those could be my highlights. All right, so I'm all done with the pumpkin there. It was time to get started with preparing my color mixtures that I would be using for the mushroom. So once again, I want to make sure that I'm setting myself up for success and preparing the different colors that I'm going to be using on my color mixing palette so that I can make sure that I have my colors ready for me to drop in while that initial layer is still wet. And I'm making sure that I have lighter browns and darker browns and a reddish brown here so that I can have a variety of values and also of hues. I am repeating some of the colors that I had already created for my pumpkin here. I made a little bit more of the lighter brown, which is the mixture of the raw sienna plus a bit of Van Dyke brown. I prepared a darker brown by mixing together Van Dyke brown with a little bit of the raw sienna, but it had just a tiny bit of raw sienna in it and it was mostly Van Dyke brown. And finally, I created a dark reddish brown by mixing together burnt sienna plus Van Dyke brown. So you can see all those three colors swatched out on my scrap piece of watercolor paper for you. And with my nice juicy color mixtures ready for me on my color mixing palette, it was time to start painting the mushroom. With my larger size 5 round brush, I'm going to be starting with this bottom section of the mushroom. And I always get started with the lighter color of the set that I'm going to be using for the section on hand. So for this underneath and stem portion of the mushroom, I use my lighter brown and my darker brown. So initially I go in with my lighter brown. I go in quickly, making sure that I leave some highlights. And while that initial lighter layer of brown is still wet, I drop in the darker brown in sections that I want to push darker values in. Once I finished painting that underneath and bottom stem section of the mushroom, I then get started with painting in the top part. So for this top part, the two colors that I'm going to be using are the darker reddish brown and the darkest brown. I go in with the lighter color of the two, which in this case is the reddish brown. And then while that initial layer is still wet, I drop in the darkest brown. Visualize your shadow areas, and that's where you want to drop in your darker colors. You can see me do a little bit of lifting here with my clean and only slightly damp bristles of my paintbrush. You can always go in with your absorbent towel or the bristles of your paintbrush as long as they're clean and only slightly damp. You can use them as a little absorbent sponge whenever you feel you've placed way too much color on your paper or you want to pull up some highlights. All right, moving on to the sunflower. So once again, I'm preparing the color mixtures that I'm going to be using for all of these parts of the sunflower. For the petals, I'm going to need a yellow and an orange. So I prepare some pure Indian yellow for myself with some water in it. And you can see that in that largest well in the center part of my color mixing palette. And then for my orange, I'm going to repeat that same lighter orange that I had already created for my pumpkin, which is a mixture of Indian yellow and permanent red light. I also want a darker reddish brown and a dark brown. So I prepare more of my burnt sienna plus Van Dyke brown color mixture. That's that reddish brown that you see on the top left that I had used in the mushroom previously. And the darker brown underneath it is just the darker brown mixture that I have been using so far. I just add a lot more of the Van Dyke brown into it. So right here you can see these 4 colors that I'm going to be using for the sunflower swatched out for you. The yellow, the orange, the reddish brown, and the darker brown. And with all this ready for me on my color mixing palette, I'm gonna go ahead and get started with painting in quickly and loosely using my size 5 round brush. As always, I start with the lighter color of the 2 or the 3 that I'm gonna be using for this section on hand. So I start out with the petals, and for the petals, my lighter color is the Indian yellow. And because I want to make sure that that initial lighter color is still wet before dropping in the second color, which is going to be the orange, I decide to tackle these petals a section at a time or a group at a time, instead of making my way all the way around in a counterclockwise or clockwise way. I just go section by section with that initial lighter color. And then before that dries, I go in and drop in the orange, and then I move on to the next group, and then to the next group, and so on and so forth. All right, so I am all done with the petals for now, and it is now time to tackle that central part of the flower. I'm gonna keep using this same size 5 round brush. I go in initially with the lighter color that I'm gonna be using in this section, which is the reddish brown. That is a mixture of burnt sienna plus Van Dyke brown. I am still using my size 5 round brush, by the way, but you could switch on over to using your smaller brush if you feel more comfortable. But I am using a light scribbling technique using just the tip of my paintbrush. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to a past video that I shared on basic brushstrokes for beginners learning watercolor down below for you in the description box, in which I explain all about scribbling and many other must-know brushstrokes to learn about and practice. The scribbling technique I thought would be a great way for me to not only develop color and also value, but continue also describing the texture in the central part of the sunflower. It's always super helpful to give thought to how to alter and change the way that you're using your paintbrush depending on the texture on hand. Scribbling also allowed me to leave little abstract shapes of that whiteness of the paper shining through for those highlights, which also helps me describe that irregular texture. And while that initial layer of reddish brown was still wet, I dropped in the darker brown in the centralmost section of the sunflower and also around the edges of that larger circle, and that helped me make a kind of raised look to that central part of the sunflower. All right, you guys, so this is the very final part of this process, and this is completely optional. If you like the way that your illustrations look the way they are, leave them be. There is no reason to push forward. So I allowed everything to dry completely, and what I'm gonna go in to do now with my size 2 round brush is I'm just gonna push darkest dark areas a little bit more. And the reason this is because watercolor tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So for some of us who like pushing contrast a little bit more and making things just pop a little bit more, it's worth coming back to see the painting, the piece, the illustrations after everything has dried, and noticing if we want to push darkest dark areas a little bit more. If you decide to push through to this part of the process, I would highly recommend to keep your darkest shapes very abstract, very irregular. Make sure that you're going in loosely and lightly, and remember that less is more. It's very easy to overwork your watercolor pieces, and you don't want to do more than what's truly necessary. Okay, so all I am doing here is noticing what little sections I want to darken a little bit more, and I am using the same color that I was using underneath for the last layer in that section in a slightly more saturated state than what I was using before. All this means is that that color mixture has a little bit less water in it. So I'm just pushing darkest shadow areas, maybe adding in a tiny bit more texture here and there with very light translucent paint. And in the sunflower, I'm really gonna focus on going over the little cast shadow areas in between the petals so that I can enhance or describe that overlapping a little bit more. And I'm also going to be adding in a little bit more scribbling, enhance that texture in the central part of the sunflower a little bit more with the same colors that I use in this area. And I'm just going in wet on dry this time. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.